Hello, my friends. I'm sorry for the delay. I haven't posted anything for about 4 days. I had a little bit of an accident in the kitchen. I sort of cut myself pretty badly in 2 fingers here. Anyway, it's okay now. It's healing very well, but I couldn't very well write or do a lot of things. So anyway, I'm fine. And I decided to do today the last is going to be the last of this series that I've been doing on Freemasonry, and this last one is going to be more on the geopolitical aspect of it all, and how it is my belief that whenever there is a revolution or some wars or some chaos everywhere, they are not very far away. I'm going to concentrate on just 2 revolutions, really. One is both at the beginning of the 20th century, the First World War and the Russian Revolution in the year 1917. Okay, so one of the official histories or bits of history that we have about how the Americans entered the First World War goes something like this. On 6th of April 1917, American President Woodrow Wilson, who was an academic, by the way, a professor, declared war on Germany. Until that day, the United States had remained neutral. The declaration of war was a response to the submarine war that Germany had been waging on its enemies since January 1917. Germany, so the story goes, wanted to sink all ships sailing toward the United Kingdom, including passenger ships and neutral American ships, as they could be carrying aid from food to soldiers for Germany's opponents. Germany knew that the United States would respond, but they believed that the United States would take so long to prepare that the British would have quit their efforts by then. But they were wrong. Another reason for the American declaration of war was the interception of the so-called Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany promised Mexico financial support and American territory if it would attack, that's Mexico, if it would attack the United States. Mexico refused the request. The telegram had been sent in code, but it was deciphered by the English Secret Service. The Americans were outraged. So in 1917, the United States sent more than 1 million troops to France. It took another year before they were fighting alongside the Allies in substantial numbers. All right, so that is more or less how we see officially the entry of the United States in the First World War. The other thing that we know is that it was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria that started the whole war. Yeah. And that is the reason why so many times we hear things like, anything, wars start because, just sometimes one silly incident and that's it. And, we have to be careful not to make mistakes because something like that could start a whole war and so on. That is the official history. But I want to bring your attention to one gentleman, an American gentleman, who was involved in both the First World War, American entry in the First World War for sure, the Treaty of Versailles then, and also the Russian Revolution. And this gentleman is, not very many people know of him. He didn't particularly want to be out there, either. His name was Colonel Edward Mandell House. The colonel had not been earned; he had been granted this title, but he becomes a crucial key figure in the history of the world. But because he's going to change Europe and the world completely. But one of those who have remained in the shadows, hidden, although he was at the time the special advisor or assistant to President Wilson, and he was pretty much in the White House. They saw him sometimes as a shadow president. He had a great deal of influence on President Wilson. Now, let me tell you a little bit about him. He was in charge of the White House. At least some people, so much in charge, as a matter of fact, that some people thought that the president would not take a decision without consulting House. But he is a sort of a very disconcerting character in many aspects, and one who gives us the key to many, let's say, Freemasonry strategies. House belonged specifically to the lodge Master of Wisdom. It was a Luciferian or Illuminati obedience, and therefore globalist, because this goes hand in hand with the Bavarian Illuminati. You remember that I told you in the previous video on the Illuminati that they were actually the ones certainly behind the French Revolution, and they were expelled from Vienna, from Bavaria. All right, so he belonged to one of them, and another lodge, very important, is the Rockefeller Lodge, that comes from them as well. They were expelled, and many of them went to separate places, but many of them ended up in the United States in the 18th century. And as I said, from there also the Grand Rockefeller Lodge, that has very much to do with globalism and financed by very many front organizations. Mandell House belonged to that family, that orientation, and had plans for Europe. So first we're going to see him in these various aspects of, the First World War and so on. We are also going to see him taking part very much in financing Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary who was at the time in New York, and making it possible for him, together with, I think, his $20 million at the time, going back to Russia. But let's start first with Europe. He contributed because he left with about 200 revolutionaries, and they were stopped in Halifax in Canada, and it was, as a matter of fact, House that telephoned the Canadians and told them to just let them go, do not interfere. Now, Mandell House had written a novel. It was fiction, but it was a sort of a cover-up for what he wanted, how he saw the politics and the governance of the United States and how he wanted to change it. At the beginning, he has a plot and about the Civil War and so on, but let me tell you a little bit about the book. It's supposed to be a novel, and I'll read you from one commentary here. It was difficult to find, but not so much anymore with internet. If this novel has been sounding too much like a melodramatic potboiler, because it wasn't really all that good, what is important about it is his new vision of how the United States has to be governed. In other words, bringing down the power of the states, diminishing the power of many other things. Okay, so you would not be mistaken to have arrived at such a conclusion, that it was a little bit of a potboiler. But House was far from finished. In fact, victory in this civil war with which he starts the book takes place at roughly the halfway point of the book. Calling it a novel or even a melodramatic potboiler from this point on is at best a stretch. The title of chapter 25 of a total of 53 chapters gives the new game away immediately: the administration of the Republic. What we have in the remainder of the novel, and he was very eager to send it to President Wilson and for him to read it. What we have in the remainder of the novel is less a story than a laundry list of recommendations for organizing and conducting a new government in post-Civil War America. Post-Civil War too, because he has another civil war there in the middle. And so President-elect Wilson may or may not have been caught up in the melodramatic rise to the power of Philip Drew. That is the title of the book. Philip Drew, D-R-U. Philip Drew, the Administrator. That's the title. So President-elect Wilson may or may not have been caught up in the melodramatic rise to power of Philip Drew, but in all likelihood, Colonel House wanted the new president to pay closest attention to his policy and organizational recommendations. Just to make certain that Wilson, or any reader, would do just that, House put these publicly pronounced words in Philip Drew administrator's mouth. Quote, "Any attempt to foster the powers of the late government would be regarded as seditious and would be punished by death." In other words, the United States had been involved in a second civil war, and any attempt to foster the powers of the late government would be regarded as seditious and would be punished by death. He's going to become a dictator, but he doesn't call him a dictator, but an administrator. House then had Drew announce that he would assume the powers of a dictator, distasteful as that might be to him. Distasteful or otherwise, Drew regarded such a step as necessary in order to purge the government of the abuses that had arisen. He then concluded his remarks by proclaiming himself to be the administrator of the Republic. Are republics run by administrators? Apparently, Drew and House thought so. Are republics run that way now? No doubt Drew and House and Wilson hoped so. Is such a result a good deal? No doubt Drew and House and Wilson believed that to be the case. And just how did Philip Drew acquire power? It's never quite clear in the book, but not to worry about such grubby, even petty details. The newly crowned, or should that simply be acclaimed, administrator would never become a dictator. After all, he had promised as much. In fact, hadn't he pledged to retire once the contemplated reforms had been put in place? Of course he had. House does not record the crowd's reaction to Philip Drew's pledge. He simply and matter-of-factly lets it be known that no one doubted the administrator's word. In the meantime, the administrator, who was not yet a dictator, increased the size of his new government army from 500,000 to 600,000. Drew also began consulting with Senator Selwyn, who, much to the administrator's surprise, was not without patriotism. Therefore, why not put him in charge of overhauling the machinery of both the federal government and all states' governments? Then comes a new code of laws. Never mind the Bill of Rights. A new code of laws. Are they decreed or enacted? House never quite makes that clear, but it's a small matter anyway, given the administrator's pledge to act forcefully, but then retire. However, the date of or the reason for that retirement is also never made clear, but here is the important thing about the book. There are many other things that are made quite clear. There will be a graduated income tax with no exemptions. Do you remember income tax was brought with the First World War? Yeah? So it's an idea, new idea. There will be a graduated income tax with no exemptions. Its maximum will be 70% on $10 million and above. False returns would result in prison sentence. Whether or not there would be a jury trial before a sentence would be handed down is also left somewhere sort of up in the air. States and state governments would apparently continue to exist in these new United States, but Drew anticipated that the scope of state authority would be dramatically limited. Once again, the devil may have been in the details, but the details are vague. Drew simply announced that the central government should take over many things in the name of efficiency and general welfare. And that was it. Where does all leave the Constitution of 1787? Just about where the young Woodrow Wilson thought it belonged, namely somewhere in the dustbin of history. In Drew's House's estimation, that document may have served the country well for its first century, but now, meaning sometime between 1920 and 1935, it is not only obsolete but even grotesque. That's the American Constitution. Drew's and House's ultimate solution was to make the American system of government more responsive and more efficient rather than more democratic. Some progressives favored such power to the people reforms as initiative, referendum, and recall, but Drew and House's did not like that. As far as they were concerned, each of the three was a clumsy weapon. Apparently, in the name of efficiency, House members would serve for 6 years, not 2, while senators would hold office for life. Presidents would be held to a single 10-year term with no possibility of a second term. But contradicting his judgment that recall is a clumsy weapon, Drew and houses do make provisions for recalling House and Senate members, as well as presidents and federal judges. Near the end of the series of chapters dealing with Drew's and House's plans for a post-Constitution of 1787 America, the semblance of a story and a novel returns. At the heart of it is Drew's evolving relationship with Senator Selwyn, that was, in his mind, President Wilson, who has come to love Drew as a son. And in the concluding chapters, the two work together to put in place what we have come to call the administrative state, which has proven to be something other than the apolitical, expertise-driven state that Drew and Houses envisioned. Then again, a hint of things to come might be seen in the alliance between Drew and the highly political Selwyn. Okay, so he's reading this book. He's very eager. So it's very clear that he thinks it's a good idea to change the Constitution, that the Constitution was okay for the first century, but not anymore, really. So new ideas about how to change the government of America. Very eager to have President Wilson read this. It is very clear that he talks about achieving a society pretty much like the one conceived by, I don't think it would be an exaggeration, by Karl Marx. But in any case, okay, so First World War, America enters the war, Treaty of Versailles. And now we have to the first example that I want to give you about how they dealt with the Emperor of Austria, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, which was the Catholic, of course, Habsburg. And let's see what happened here. Charles I of Austria, the emperor, is actually blessed in the Catholic Church. From 1887 to 1922, he was the last emperor of the Habsburg dynasty in Austria. He comes to the throne very, very young, but above all in the middle of, in 1916, right in the middle of World War I. He's going to try to get Austria out of the war. There are many machinations here, but meets with fierce opposition from the Allied powers to negotiate. They do not want a separate peace. They had their plans. So all this is going on, and in comes Colonel House, who supported the entry into the war by the United States unconditionally. Without his pressure, probably Wilson would not have gone in, because the campaign for the presidency, the last time round anyway, had been completely a sort of more of a pacifist or isolationist campaign. I don't know whether everyone would agree with the word, but certainly not pro-entering the war. He had promised neutrality of the US, which is really what most people wanted at the time. But you see, in the scheme of things and those hands working, in secret, the Austrian Empire had to disappear. Certainly Masonic plans. Anyone who has studied in, even not a great depth, how they influence the outcome of this war has to agree to this. There are biographers of the Habsburgs who all agree, really, that the Masons, they consider themselves, they consider the Habsburgs their declared enemies. So there's no possibility of sustaining Charles on the throne, no separate peace. The whole thing is about achieving the defeat of Austria, and for that, the Allies, not only the United States but also France, will promote the usual. And you know how all these things start. It's never really the one lone gunman. Come on, okay? Okay. It usually starts when you want to start a revolution. You start by fomenting and fostering dissidence among the population. Yes, if there is a division about, with religion or language, or perhaps, 500 years ago, this part of your country belonged to that, so you want to go back to that or to the other one. Anyway, whatever the fault lines are, that is what you are going to promote. First of all, these, well, we call it color revolutions now, don't we? So groups that ask for something specifically, and this is essential, that you see as this particular group or that particular group asking for or demanding something in order to create a revolution. Because the important thing here is that we are here to grant what you ask for. In other words, we are here to concede, never to impose. Oh no, you ask for this, that is what we will give you. I grant what is, we grant, we the powerful, we are just granting what you ask of us. But for that, there has to be a claim. And so they usually support, and they certainly supported then, nationalist groups, especially in Europe with all the changes of limits and frontiers and borders and so on. That's pretty easy, okay? So you support nationalist groups who are asking for independence, and how can you not listen to those voices of the oppressed? And in the middle of World War I, you have some actually quite picturesque sort of meetings and congresses that come together to listen to the voices of the oppressed. And there is one congress that is called, actually, and I quote it, "The oppressed peoples of the Danube," who were asking, the oppressed peoples of the Danube. You can think of so many other groups, that come up every now and then. Okay, so these were the oppressed peoples of the Danube come up. The cry for freedom from the peoples of the Danube, imagine. In this case, there were Czechs for the most part. Hungary did not enter. The Czech Freemasonry here had quite an important role, as well as Italians. There is an Italian Congress, an Italian committee, the Slovenians. In short, there is a series of committees that come together or are created that meet in these congresses. There was one in Rome, asking for self-determination, so to speak. In fact, they were really representing themselves, because the populace, the support for them was practically nil. Nothing. But the degree of nationalism in the way that they were expressing it at that time, despite the war, was quite insignificant, really. So this was man-made. But instead, what happened is that thanks to those committees, those congresses, and also the projection that the media gave them, the press, publicity, and so on, at the end of the war, the Allies' representatives communicated to the emperor, to his ambassador, that they had the full support of the Allies, especially of the US. And so he was left without the empire. The empire, long story, but it disappears. Several things here. Attack on Sarajevo. This was of Masonic influence, indisputable. There are witnesses' accounts. For example, one which I picked up from authors regarding the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. One testimony, for example, from Empress Zita. I'll tell you a little bit more about her in a minute, or one of her sons. And the other is a biographer of the Emperor Franz, Karl Franz. And both separately come to say the same thing. A few months before, in 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand invites his nephews for dinner. Those are Charles I and Zita, the Empress, heirs to the empire. And he tells them that he knows, he is certain that he is going to die soon, and that in his desk there are several documents that concern them specifically, directly. And he said, they are yours. As soon as I die, please take them. His nephew, of course, tells him not to be such a pessimist. Yes, there are troubled times and so on, but the police, the empire police, is efficient. And Franz Ferdinand says, yes, but there are crimes that cannot be avoided. He had known, according to historians, he had known about the fact that he knew about a Freemasons plot. And their objective is known. Anyway, he is killed, he dies. Certainly there is a black hand here. They were there once the heir to the throne was eliminated. That is the trigger for the outbreak of war, which is going to be very useful, that war, for certain political projects. Because without World War I, the world would have obviously been very different. And really, it doesn't cost them much to launch such a cataclysm. Of course, the Masons were not the only responsible ones, obviously. There was a lot of irresponsibility and unawareness, and a sort of a collective madness of many rulers at the time. There is no doubt about that. But behind it all, there is this component. And in regard to this, to the Blessed Emperor, it was the same case with the last, not the last king. I was going to say the last king. No, we have a king now. The Alphonse XIII of Spain, before the Civil War. They're actually forcing him to do certain things which he rejects, and they told him specifically, you will lose, there will be a republic in your country. So anyway, it's the same thing. They proposed to them their entry into Freemasonry or an acceptance of their plan. And certainly with the King of Spain, Alfonso XIII, but also the same thing happened with the Emperor. He received a Masonic commission, a committee, that proposed to him entry into the association, it was and certain changes also, especially in those days, very important in those days, of changing the educational system to a secular system. That was a huge issue at the time. And also the reform of the family, which is always the same thing where you find everywhere. The Emperor said no. Neither of them ever considered it. So it's more complicated still, because in the first, he has to go into exile to Switzerland, and in the first stage of the exile, he receives another proposal, and this is even more shocking, because it is to enter into, or to go along with their plan, because if he did, he would indeed be in time to recover the throne. The throne would be given back to him. The proposal was very, very specific and very clear. They proposed to him, they offered him, in exchange for his entry or acceptance, the throne of Hungary, in which there was a regency, of very difficult access, since there was a regent there and there would have been many obstacles to that. But certainly it's a kingdom. It would have been easier to start there. And they even tell him about the possibility of recovering the throne of Austria later on as well. But for the moment it was to start with the being the king of Hungary. So first they offered to keep him on the throne, and then, more difficult still, to return to your throne when you've already lost it. That's kind of difficult, but in any case, no, he doesn't want to hear about any of this, or entering into any association, or considering their plans, naturally. And they certainly had, the emperor and his wife certainly had the feeling that there was, in their words, a Masonic conspiracy. Probably because they lived it, but you can say, well, in those days everything, everyone was saying about the Freemasons and so on. Well, there are reasons to believe that there was a conspiracy behind it all. The Empress Zita told her biographer, Cyril Debris, Zita of Bourbon Parma. She died in 1989. A very, very devout Catholic, large family too. She was almost 100 when she died. Anyway, she told her biographer, Cyril Debris, in a book. It's actually quite an interesting book. It's entitled Zita of Bourbon Parma, Intimate Portrait of an Empress. So this is actually also a spiritual biography. It's a very interesting book, where you can see the amazing Catholic faith of this couple who didn't sell out. She tells the story of, just to give you an idea of how this conspiracy was very much on their minds. She had a friend whom she trusted. He was a nun, and she corresponded with her, and they had known each other for a long time, and she corresponded with her and had great trust in her, and she was a confidant. And she asks this nun to pray for her. She says, just to see if she can find an answer to this question. She said that there is one person around her that many people had told her to be careful, because he was not actually working in her favor, but very much against her. And she explains in her letter that that came as a surprise to her, because she knew him well, and she never felt that he would be a spy or a conspirator or anything like that. And gives her details. And she says, in the letter, she says, personally, I don't see it. I would have never thought of such thing about him. I find him very trustworthy. But there were so many different sources advancing her of this, that she actually says, in the letter she says, do you think that he could actually be a Freemason? So this Freemason thing was very much in their minds. They could perhaps be half insane, but it's very, very much in the air. They all believe that there is a conspiracy. Just to tell you a little bit about Empress Zita, she was born in 1892 and died in 1989, was the wife of Charles I, the last monarch of Austria-Hungary. As such, she was the last Empress of Austria and Queen of Hungary, in addition to other titles. She was declared Servant of God by Pope Benedict XVI. Born as the 17th child of the dispossessed Robert I, Duke of Parma, and his second wife, the Infanta Maria Antonia of Portugal, Zita married the then Archduke Charles of Austria in 1911. Charles became heir presumptive to the Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria in 1914, after the assassination of his uncle, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, and acceded to the throne in 1916, after the elderly emperor's death. After the end of World War I, in 1918, the Habsburgs were deposed and the former empire became home to the states of Austria, Hungary and Czechoslovakia, while other parts were annexed to or joined the Kingdom of the Serbs, the Croats and the Slovenes, Italy, Romania and a reconstituted independent Poland. So it was divided in little bits and pieces. This is something that is always done. It had been done in the 1800s in Latin America. It was the English at that time and the French that divided up those huge areas, except for Brazil. That's another story. but they always, this breaking up into tiny little pieces is always something that is done in order to control it better. Charles and Zita left for exile in Switzerland, and after the failure of attempts to restore royal rule in Hungary, were subsequently removed from that country by the Allies to Madeira, the island of Madeira there, belonging to Portugal now in the Atlantic, where Charles died in 1922, so very early on. After her husband's death, she would die, imagine, in 1989. After her husband's death, Zita and her son Otto served as symbols of unity for the exiled dynasty. A devout Catholic, she raised a large family after being widowed at the age of 29, and she never remarried. Okay, so that is Empress Zita. There is a famous anecdote that Pope John Paul II actually met her, and when he did, he actually kissed her hand and said, now I finally meet my Empress, or some words to that effect. Anyway, okay, so in other biographies there is always also reference to a particular doctor who tended to misdiagnose whatever her complaints were a little bit more than necessary. And again, she's now about to lose a child in a pregnancy and giving birth and die herself in the penultimate pregnancy. And the Empress's mother herself says, what is going on here? There is something going on. Anyway, the fact is that they feel that they are surrounded by enemies, and they know who those enemies, the conspirators, might be coming from. Whether true or not, okay, what the book reflects is that the fear of this group of people was very much there. They would intervene again in this case after her husband died. Anyway, there is a series of things that happened, and even when he was alive, she had to encounter a number of, because she was such a tower of strength for him, for the emperor, that they actually, were very much, in favor of weakening her resolve. That concern was there with the imperial family. And the question is whether or not you think, or I think, that they had clear reasons for that fear. In any case, she was a very lovely lady, it seems, because from that book also, about Zita, the Empress, in a letter she writes, our reign was not long, but it was happy. When the emperor died more than a year ago now, the children and I pleaded to the Sacred Heart of Jesus for him to be, perhaps even more now, the head of our family. And you know the different paths along which our head of the family has taken us. The head of our family has always looked after us. And she goes on. This is a letter from the 20th of March 1923. So with all that happened to her, she actually found a sort of an inner peace, this woman, an interesting woman. Not very many people know about her. Because in the midst of all that, she said that she was happy, content. So the concept of human happiness differs, doesn't it, from one person to another. Imagine what they gave up and what they could have taken back. The heritage, the imperial heritage, the palaces of Vienna, the library, the museums where you find all the assets of the crown of Austria. It was at the time one of the most impressive fortunes in the world. And he, the emperor, ended up living off charity, the charity of a foreigner who let him have a house of his, unsanitary, but is the one that he had in Madeira, in the island of Madeira. That is what he offered him for him to take refuge there. And Empress Zita, his widow, ends up living off charity also from a group of people from Bilbao in Spain who arranged for her to have a place. And she says she actually can actually say we were happy together. Perhaps he even more than her. She had her times when perhaps she wasn't as much. But he died happy. Had he agreed to everything, he would have been there wearing his crown and sitting on his throne in his palace, counting up his money, I suppose. Anyway, so this is just to say of how this society, this secret society, it is clear, this is not, a made-up thing, that they are involved in changing societies, for sure. Certainly in all the changes and, I would say, destruction of Christian Europe. And they have, I think I have alluded to this before I go on to the Russian Revolution, that you see what change in the 20th century actually is the best invention ever that they did, because they came out of that structure of lodges, the great lodges or the great orients, which were very much structured and very much focused on themselves, even though they had many branches and so on. But they thought of the idea, and it worked, of having front organizations. Okay, they opened up to organizations called screen or front organizations, and with reason. But in them, they can coexist or form part of that organization with other people who are not Masons. Okay, they have not been initiated, but nevertheless they will follow on their strategy, their overall strategy. So the fields of action open up exponentially, really, and already have an influence, but now much, much greater. Without these organizations necessarily having to be Masonic, but certainly obeying Masonic strategies, such as I think I mentioned in one of the previous videos, the CFR, the Council for Foreign Relations in the United States, for example. Who founded it? Oh, our friend Colonel House himself, taking advantage during the Treaty of Versailles, in a meeting there in Paris. He organized a lunch on the occasion of the end of the war, where he invites all American and English representatives who had gone there to negotiate the treaties. Not all, but those who had already invited those who had already belonged to previous front organizations, okay, of Freemasonry. certainly the first one, the first of the first, the Round Table. He invited those, and from there comes the CFR, the Council for Foreign Relations, an organization that has since practically controlled the political life in the United States to date. And it is not all that well known in the US, I don't think. Many people don't even know it exists. But there they are with their headquarters in New York, practically determining the policies of the two great political parties, or the administration that emerges from elections, with more or less, a greater or lesser presence. But they are there, and that came from Colonel House. So of course there was a plan, a design, at least from the moment the war was over. But it is reasonable to assume that the plan was there before the war began. But in the war it ends up like this. The Austrian Empire ends. This is how it all ended. The Austrian Empire ends. A Catholic monarchy. From that monarchy, in tatters now, there will emerge small republics. Of course, those republics much, much weaker, as I said, the same as they did in Latin America, where Catholic identity for sure becomes more and more blurred. So a great success. And then they have these front organizations with a control of political life, very clever, really. Coexistence of people who are and those who are not members. So you can't say that the CFR is a Freemason organization, no. But they will follow their dictates, and they never are less than 50% in any case. And from there we have the Bilderberg, but the CFR has been there at the beginning of the gestation practically of all those organizations, Trilateral Commission and so on. Okay, so that is one example of how Europe changed dramatically. Not only a war, but what happened afterwards, the First World War. Let me talk about another example, and that is the Russian Revolution in 1917. And was Freemasonry at all involved in this? Okay, there are many loose ends here that have to be sort of tied up or brought together, intertwined or something. Remember, the 19th century, 1800s, is a century of liberalism that creates a breeding ground in two ways. A change in European thought, this is very serious. The consolidation of a new philosophy, after the French Revolution, of course, secularism, and now the consolidation of this new philosophy, which is called positivism. The replacement of religion by a new creator, the sociologist Comte, Frenchman, is the new religion of humanity. The new religion of humanity is going to be, at that time, science. Together with positivism, it brings with it a fierce materialism to the 19th century, to the society of the 19th century. And to make matters worse, there are a lot of workers' associations beginning they had to emerge, obviously, sooner or later, workers coming together. Because at that time, liberalism lacked a social sense during the whole of the 19th century. Governments did not have a social policy. Free trade was excellent for many things, but it imposed for many workers, a sort of a Bronx law, they called it, because of its harshness. The way workers had no representation, they couldn't even vote at the time, and yet they were made to work for all those long hours. We all know about the children and so on. That was society at the time. So the liberalism at that time, the governments did not have this sense of social policy. And so what you had was a whole bunch of the majority of society being disinherited from everything, because during the Industrial Revolution, you remember, they went from the countryside where they worked in the land, or they were artisans or whatever. That world was gone. They moved to the city to work in factories, and the whole of society, your whole way of life changed then. And what happened, so the advantage was that you had a guaranteed wage at the end of the month, which was pretty good, better than having to depend on the weather, whether you're going to have a good harvest or not. So they saw it very much as an advance, But at the same time, by all moving to the cities, to work in factories in such large numbers, they left the extended family and the community behind. So here you were in the big city and you didn't even know your neighbors, kind of thing. So they had to, I say disinherited, because they had to abandon more than just their friends and perhaps their, if not immediate, extended family, but also all the traditions and all the way of life. All of a sudden here they were in the big cities. But there was no workers' representations. This is because I'm going to get to the Russian Revolution. So imagine this society like that, Industrial Revolution, they're abandoning their traditions and so on. So in the Industrial Revolution, great migrations from the country to the city. The masses were uprooted, spiritually also. And of course they were in many cases exploited and brutalized, millions of people. Condemned to a life without hope in many cases. They were turned practically into beasts of burden, without any types of rights or anything else. The state not regulating labor relations at the time of any kind. It was in the hands of the state to try to find the solution, but they did not want to address it at the time. And that was the liberal state. Now, at that time, you have formed the International of Workers. It was called the International. Founded in mid 19th century. Remember, the Communist Manifesto comes in 1848. Before that, in the 1830s, there is already in France a huge movement with Saint-Simon and Proudhon, property is theft, and there was a movement of workers. They created the International. And there are several congresses of this international movement of workers. There is one in 1864, another one in 1865, in 1867, in which each delegation of workers' associations sends their representatives to where it is being held. In London, for example, which is where Karl Marx attended, Karl Marx actually stood up there and said, I am not a Marxist, because he was beginning to disagree with a lot of things. But anyway, okay, so in London, The Hague also, so they met, and some sort of criteria were, discussed and imposed even. And what ends up happening is that there are two factions, two directions. One, in some case, you could say that they would end up being equally perverse, really, because one is the anarchism of Bakunin, who was a Russian, which called for the demolition of all institutions, all of them, including the state, including government. And the other was the Marxian, they called it, or Marxist, which is what finally prevails. And so anarchism is going to end up as a sort of a terrorist movement more than anything. That will do enormous harm in many Mediterranean countries in Europe at the end of the 19th century, and certainly they're very, very powerful, most powerful in Spain in the Civil War, fighting with the communists and the Republicans. Okay, so Marxism takes control of the international. And if we're going to speak of Russia, we have to understand that this is about, as I said, the Communist Manifesto is published in 1848. With that maxim, you remember, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Very powerful, very powerful. Okay, so so in 1848 there is another revolution, but this in France, but this is a bourgeois revolution, the middle classes, that comes along almost at the same time with Marxism. It is liberal, yes, but the bourgeois organizers of that revolution once again come and take the masses of the poor with them, who were already organized, and take them to the streets of Paris in demonstrations, huge demonstrations, hundreds of thousands. You had never seen demonstrations like that before. What happens is they put an end to the monarchy of Louis Philippe and proclaim a new regime, which was on the verge of becoming communist. And then on that same year, the Communist Manifesto appears. Marx is there already. Now, the first assembly of the International had not taken place yet, but the manifesto is there and launches that will be really the coup de grace of civil society in many aspects. Okay, so against the concepts, what is going, a major change here, against the concepts of homeland or patria, or the motherland, and religion that had the primacy, as it were. Despite the old liberal regime in Europe, they still had resonance. Marx proposes to turn them into two different concepts for the sake of the proletarian union, and to free the workers, as he puts it, from slavery. For Marx, the homeland is a perverse thing to think of, because he argues that what you, the worker, thinks is your homeland is really just the homeland of the powerful. And so you bought into that, and you don't realize that they are manipulating you. There is no such thing, he says, as your homeland. Okay, it's just a set of power structures that will always work for the benefit of the powerful and always against you. So don't be so stupid. It's nothing to do with your country. Workers of the world, unite. So he's proposing a sort of a class structure of people coming together according to economic class. Yeah. What he comes to say is really is that the French Revolution was kind of okay. It was necessary because it ended the old regime anyway, but he says it really did not do very much at all, because all it did was to replace the old masters of the ancien regime with a new masters of you, the workers, a new set of oppressors. Okay, the difference is that before you just had the king and a few nobles and stuff, and now you have all this. They have multiplied, but they are your oppressors anyway. Not in the same way, but smell the coffee. Okay. Now, this was to a large extent true because the bourgeois liberals actually had suppressed the old guilds, the last refuge of workers' organizations that had remained. Okay. In the war, for example, there are some historians, Russian historians, have recorded the fact that in many of the Russian troops fighting the Germans, that many of the troops would say, don't kill your brothers, they are the other soldiers, the German soldiers on the other side. They are like us. Do not kill your German brothers. Kill our own officers who are our true enemies. Do you see the Marxist thought here? So there was something that was going to happen. The homeland, the motherland is sort of a criminal. Start seeing us, not what you thought it was. The homeland is the one that exploits you. There is a sort of a meta history here. Okay. So the other, besides the homeland, that Marx certainly changed in the heads of the workers, his influence was religion. And religion was, he called it, the opium of the people. Religion leaves the masses defenseless before the state. Okay, so come 1917. The October Revolution is actually the last of the three revolutions that Russia experienced that year. That without World War I would not have taken place. Marx himself did not believe that Russia was ready because it was agricultural, it was not industrial. And he believed that the first revolutionaries will come from Britain or other European countries, from the Industrial Revolution, the workers in the factories, not peasants working in the countryside. He never expected Russia to be the first one to take up the moving forward. So it was, in a sense, and he was right, in a sense he was provoked, this revolution was provoked in a very artificial manner. Now the question is, who provoked that war? For what purpose? To what end? Russia was an agricultural society. Serfdom had been made illegal in 1861. Customs and traditions go on for a very, very long time. 1917, you still had a Russia that, a peasant would bow to his master kind of thing. Okay, these people would not have thought of a revolution in this way. So who provoked it? For what purpose? To what end? A very clear purpose: to undo Europe, Christian Europe. That was the whole overall thing. And within the objectives of Christian Europe, there was a very desirable one, which was to dismantle Holy Mother Russia, which is what was called. Because even then, it was perhaps the only, not the only one, but Christian country wholeheartedly, 100%. The other one was perhaps Poland. And Spain had already been defeated, and the virus of secularism from France had already come there. That was the other main Catholic country. But right now we have just Russia and Poland too. That's true. But it was certainly, Russia was one of the most Christian countries in Europe. Now, question: is Freemasonry involved in this communist revolution? Well, I tell you, yes, if there is a revolution, most probably. Perhaps more than it would at first appear. Okay, let me start. The Russian Revolution can be divided in 3 stages. Taking advantage of the fact that the Tsar is at the front fighting, they have the opportunity to first create a revolution in February 17th, which is a liberal revolution. That's against the Tsar, that they had not had. Prince Lvov takes charge. But this regime falls almost immediately because the second revolution in July is the socialist revolution of Kerensky. So they have a liberal one. Okay, so they're going in a few years going through, what other European countries took perhaps centuries. So the liberal one fails. Then the socialist revolution of Kerensky in July. Kerensky is a socialist, very radical. He is a Freemason. And he forms a government in which, except for 2 people, all of them belong to lodges. All of them are Freemason. In other words, that is the second phase. So in this second phase, this socialist revolution of July, this is a Masonic revolution, as the ones that had taken place in Europe in the previous century. So we have then a first introduction of Masonry and a revolution in Russia. Then there is a third one, the communist one with Lenin. Yeah, that's the one we know, the Bolsheviks. There is in the 19th century, there are many people who have been in these secret societies and then come out, not very many of them, usually for some religious conversion. Most of them, I don't know exactly what happens, but, or perhaps my initial response is, are they playing games? But some of them write about it, and anyway, there is this one in the 19th century historian, Mariano Rojas, who publishes then one of those ritual in the 33-degree practice, when they initiate the people. And he says the following: to what world have to go those who had already reached that very high degree in Freemasonry? I didn't write these properly, but the three main things that they have to have acquired or digested. Okay. Quote: the three infamous murders of our great master, murderers. The three infamous murderers of our great master are law, property, and religion. Enemies, okay? Law, property, and religion. Now that is a little bit surprising. I can understand the religious part of it, the religion part of it, but law and property really doesn't make sense. Because it would seem shocking that an organization, a society that has been so encouraged and fostered and moved by economic interests for so long, that it has them, or it counts them, that has controlled economic interest also for so long, that it would speak of property, for example, as one of their infamous enemies. They call them infamous murderers or infamous assassins of our great teacher, a hypothetical grandmaster, of course. Well, at first, he says the law, because it is not in harmony. Listen to this, okay, because this is why things are sometimes so confused and diffused. Why is the law one of our enemies? And you're going to be surprised. Because it is not in harmony with the rights of the isolated man. And property, because land belongs to no one. This is in the 33rd degree, okay, or grade. And this is said, and it doesn't make sense, for a society that has a huge percentage of bankers, the richest in the world. What problem do they have with property? And yet they are told, that they are informed that the land belongs to no one. Interesting. That was already there in the French Revolution, as a matter of fact. There was the so-called Pantheon Club, which was openly communist. And anyway, and its products, the products of the land, continues the ritual, belong to all, according to the true needs necessary for his well-being. That sounds like truly communist indeed. You remember, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. I think now they have, you will have nothing but you will be happy, so don't worry. Okay. This is all, utopia, but I find it very strange that people with a lot of power who, reign in the world with such dominion and such huge economic interest would say, what the land belongs to no one and things like that. So in grade 33, this is a communist declaration. It's clear and it is open. And you think of all those generals and millionaires and billionaires and politicians. First contradiction. Okay. Continues. The other one, religion. We're going to come back to the property and the law, and you will see where that goes. Continues. Religion. The third infamous assassin of our great master, because religions are nothing more than philosophies of talented men that the people have adopted and to constitute and under their constitutions, and to increase, they think, in their well-being. A fallacy of clever men who have been inventing religious beliefs all along in order to, have dominion over the vulnerable. This was in the French Revolution too. In the 18th century, there was a Masonic pamphlet published, which was entitled The Tribes of the Impostors. And on the cover of it was a caricature of Christ, Muhammad, and Moses. This is the French Revolution. All impostors. So that thesis actually was already there in the Enlightenment. But it appears there in the degree 33rd with all clarity, and continues, quote, "Neither law nor property nor religion can therefore impose themselves upon man, and as they annihilate him, deprive him of his most precious rights. And so they are murderers against whom we have sworn to exercise the loudest revenge." Yeah, revenge is always there. "Enemies to whom we have sworn all-out war at all costs." Okay, that is religion. Of these three infamous enemies, religion must be the constant object of our deadly attacks, because a people have never survived their religion. People never survive their religion. You kill their religion, society is gone. The peoples have never survived their religion, that is how they put it, and by killing religion, we will have at our disposal the land and the property. So, law and property were bad, apparently, but no, if you take away religion, then you can have access to that law and that property, and then it becomes acceptable to them. And, continues the quote, "and we will be able to regenerate society, establishing on the corpses of those murderers Masonic law and property." End of quote. And this ritual is telling us about all revolutions, liberal and not liberal, communist revolutions even. And it's justifying a communist regime long before it has triumphed. So this was written about the time of the International, more or less, in the Third Congress. There was still a while to go. This is in 1892. There's still a while to go until 1917, but this is the situation. Okay, so let's go to specific details of how the revolution came about. So we had left Russia, remember, one first liberal revolution, within months a second socialist revolution. We have left Russia then immersed in a socialist revolution. And it was really an open Masonic revolution, but the revolution and the revolutionaries were actually devouring themselves. It is a Russia divided, taken over by the Mensheviks first and then the Bolsheviks, one of socialist orientation, the others directly of a communist orientation, one's more radical than the others, but in the end there is a common objective. When, thanks to the first phase of the revolution, thanks to those amnesties that come with the first revolutionary phase against the Tsar, the communist leaders who were either imprisoned, like Stalin in Siberia, or in exile, like Lenin and Trotsky, now it turns out that they can actually return to Russia without danger. It's in the context of First World War, to their country. And without them, there would have been no communist revolution in Russia in 1917. How do they return? Well, let me tell you. The best known case is the case of Lenin. Lenin, who had taken refuge in Switzerland. Now, the German government puts at his disposal the famous armored wagon and train, full of gold, that a Jewish banker makes available, the Barber family, a very important family in the Russian Revolution and also a very important family in the American economy. The Warburg family, as I said, is a Jewish-German family, of which only one, Max, is the one who stays behind in Germany. The other two go to the United States. And pay attention to this point. Information by marriage alliances and investments in the main American banking system at the time. It is the great Jewish American banking family, the very top partners with the Rothschilds. This is the Warburg family. Though the majority of capital belonged to those other families, the Jacobovich Schiff. Okay, and the other one is Kumlöb. Okay, the German Warburg, the one in Germany, is the one who provides the money to Lenin so that he can cross German territory without problems in his famous armored wagon and reach Russian territory as soon as possible. But you see, if you think about it, that is kind of understandable that the Germans would help Lenin to go and create a revolution there. Why? Because Germany, at the end of the day, has a great interest in Lenin reaching Russia, because the first thing that he is going to do, or he is paid to do, or they know he wants to do, is what he promised, that the first day that he takes power, he will withdraw the Russian armies from the Eastern Front. The Russians were fighting the Germans. Part of the deal is that Lenin takes over and he withdraws the troops. And so that would be a very good thing for the Germans. They don't have to worry about the Eastern Front. They can concentrate on the others, So, of course, Germany is interested in that. That is a sort of a normal geopolitics anyway. Apart from the fact that he comes with something else, they were also counting on the collapse of the Tsar, collapse as soon as the communist revolution won. A silver bridge to Mr. Lenin, all the gold that can be provided for the project was given to him, and they put him in motion on the path of the enemy. Actually, Lenin is a Trojan horse that the Germans put there in Russia. The plan is Machiavellical, yes, but if you think about it, it can be understood. The reasons can be understood. But much more difficult to understand. Well, okay, hold on. Stalin, so Lenin is going to Russia, right? Stalin was in Siberia, so Stalin had no problem coming back. He had been deported, and so all he has to do is to get on a train, I suppose, and there he is in St. Petersburg. He is the first one to arrive, without problems of any kind. But there is a third character here, the third protagonist in this story, and he is the most interesting part of the three to a certain extent, and that is Trotsky. If you know, Trotsky has a certain aura with university students, even to these days, like a sort of a Che Guevara, okay? University students studying politics, they are never Stalinists, they're never, but they are all Trotskyists, or Trotskyites, some people say, okay? During the university years, they are the best. If I were the chief of, the intelligence services, I would certainly recruit these people, because when you learn Marxism and you are learning about how power is exercised and how to exercise it, these people are very good at understanding politics because they understand power. And so while they are students, they will be, sometimes they're called the champagne socialists, okay? And they all end up having great jobs, CEOs and prime ministers, and they all end up there, okay? But this is the aura of Trotsky, okay? The real revolutionary. No one else was. Okay, so this Trotsky guy is particularly interesting. Okay, so Trotsky is the one who had gone further in that escape. Trotsky was in New York, where he was working in a communist newspaper. And obviously he was recruited by the powers that be, as many of them are. He kept in touch with a few dozens of exiled Russian communists, and at the end, actually, he had great powers of organization. And at the end, it was a group of about 200 Russians in New York, or in the United States, in any case. And when the amnesties arrived and they could all go back, the amnesties that Russia was already struggling with in that chaos that was there, was still at war, really. Trotsky organizes his return to the Russian homeland to take part in that communist revolution. How does he achieve this? How can he go back? Well, first he obtains an extraordinarily large donation. From whom? $20 million. In today's money would be about $530 million. How did you get $530 million? Okay, and that comes from the banking consortium, the Kunstloeb. the bank to which the Warburg brothers belonged, especially Paul Warburg, who is one of the founders of the American Federal Reserve Board, the American Federal Reserve Board, which is a private bankers organization. People think that it's because you have federal that it belongs to the government or something. No, they're totally private banking consortium. Okay, so they are the ones who put to Trotsky's disposal that fabulous figure so that he can return to Russia. Goodness gracious, to save mankind. And Warburg and Schiff, the other banking company, cooperate. Okay, so question. What did these bankers want out of this operation? What was that investment of $20 million in 1917? You could say, well, perhaps, because bankers and investors are always, they're clever. It could be to you don't know what is going to happen, and so you want to have a foot on both sides. Okay, it could be that. Okay. Foreseeing the success of that revolution in Russia, they probably thought, well, let's be friendly with them, and it's a way of looking after business. So we could, invest there also. But it gets more complicated because, you see, the Germans wanted to get the communists in Russia, is understood. But the Americans, because in World War I, Germany was the common enemy, but Russia and the US were on the same side. That is, with the Western democracies. The Tsar Empire had been linked to that because of an old alliance with France, never mind that. So what did they actually have to gain introducing a revolution there in Russia? If they wanted what the Germans wanted, the collapse of the Eastern Front, that would leave free hands to thousands of German soldiers to go and kill American soldiers. Free to go at the moment that the Americans joined the war. Do you understand? By the Germans not having to fight the Russians, then they could go and have more numbers to fight Americans and kill more Americans. Well, that wasn't in the interest of America, surely. So it couldn't be that. What was then? What was it then? How would they defend that position? Okay, so they did give him this money, so there had to be a reason. It couldn't be that they wanted the Germans to kill more Americans. So what was it? Had to be a hidden reason, because before the American public opinion, to know that such an enormous capital in the US would have all that money being given, and that would then participated in an operation that would exponentially increase the number of deaths of Americans in the war, that was not going to be very popular. So the money thing had to be hidden, yeah? But what was the reason? Right, but there is something that nevertheless cannot really be explained, and it is this. Something much more serious, really. Trotsky embarks in New York with his 200 collaborators When they reach Canada, they are detained. They are in Halifax by the Canadian authorities, for some reason, who prevent them from continuing on their journey. And then something happens that is the most surprising thing of everything I have been saying so far, because here we have Colonel Edward Mandell House, who enters into the picture now. Trotsky contacts him, the special assistant to President Wilson. As I said, not very well known. He was not eager to make himself known either. So he's a man who had arrived, his father had arrived in the US as a banking partner of the banking consortium firm of Kuhn Loeb, a man of enormous political skills, great connections in banking, brilliant man, intelligent, the right hand of the president, so much so that he was referred to in certain circles as the shadow president. And those who knew the White House well, in those days knew perfectly well that House's power in some occasions went far ahead of the presidential power. For example, as I mentioned, the entry of the US in World War I. So God knows what connections he used there. So Mandell House is, as I said, not only a Freemason, but belongs to the Illuminati obedience. His branch or his society is called the Master of Wisdom, a Masonic branch that comes directly from the Bavarian Illuminati, as I said. And the Bavarian Illuminati are the origins of the Lodge Columbia, founded in the US already in the 18th century, when the Duke of Bavaria expelled them from his states. At the time of the expulsion is just before the French Revolution. They went to France, they found a branch there, then they left for the United States, found the Lodge Columbia, and from that, in a straight line, comes the Grand Rockefeller Lodge in New York. So now we have the complete picture. And in between, we have the Colonel House, who belongs to that branch doing and undoing American foreign policy. Well, Trotsky, detained in Canada, asked for his help. He will know why, because in all this, there is a delivery of the money from the Kuhn Loeb banks, etc. And House directly orders the Canadian authorities, in the name of the American president, to allow Trotsky to continue on his journey. Not only that, he provides him with passports so that they can continue with absolute regularity and without any obstacles at all until they reach Russia, which was what the whole thing was about. Okay, and here comes the big question. If, I've already said that it is not really in an American interest that to recap, the Germans have paid Lenin to withdraw troops away from the front, from the Eastern Front, which means that there will be more Germans there, being able to kill more Americans, as it were. So this had to be secret. okay? And this increase in the high American mortality rate in the war, this is difficult to explain. Yeah, so it is not easily explained that the White House intervenes in this affair because, as I've said, Russia's collapse represented a rise in German power in the full war, which actually happened, and in fact happened. And there were some truly spectacular last German offensive as soon as Lenin came to power. So what were all these gentlemen from New York doing there? There's something here about ending or disrupting, or more than that, actually, the end of Holy Russia, as it was called. So to understand this is good to read that book by Mandell House, Philip Drew, the administrator, A Story of Tomorrow. That's the title of the book. Difficult to find, but you probably can find it in the internet, as I said. A story of fiction where he proposes the ideal society that he dreamed of, a society dreamed by Marx. These great bankers, partners of the banking Kuhn Loeb, and partner with Rothschild, the right-hand man of the president, Mandell, how can he have this idea of a Marxist society? He is a banker, the son of a banker, and a member of such powerful group. Okay, so in Russia, the assault on power is organized. It will not be complicated because Russia is already divided. Has already been taken over by the Soviets when those three gentlemen arrive. And the thing left is to actually carry out the last act, which is to form the Revolutionary Military Committee, formed in St. Petersburg to control the city. And Trotsky is in charge of that. In other words, he had a decisive role in the revolution. He presides the Military Revolutionary Committee. He's actually the founder of the Red Army, as it was called later. And when the capital falls, the only focus of resistance remains in the Winter Palace, where, of course, the Tsars are no longer there. Kerensky, the socialist, the second revolution, is there. And Kerensky is a Freemason socialist who has taken power in the previous phase. And the final assault to the Winter Palace takes place, and in Russia you have installed the Communist Revolution of Lenin. Now, I'll tell you some of the first measures that he took. The elimination of the opposition. This is Lenin. People say, Lenin was not really such a bad guy. It was all Stalin afterwards. They took everything out. Well, Lenin, this is what he does, in the first few days. Elimination of the opposition arising outside the party, of course. Everything foreign to the Communist Party had to disappear. Concentration of all power in the party. Also, eradication of internal opponents. There are internal purges. This is before even taking power. The concentration of all the party's power then in his own person. This is truly a model of the totalitarian states. There are two dictatorships, as a matter of fact. There is the dictatorship of the party, and then another one, a personal one, of the leader. and there is nothing else. The first measures taken by Lenin in those first few days of the revolution, he has to consolidate the regime. First, as he had promised, he withdraws from the eastern front of the war. The Germans are satisfied. Russian soldiers go home. Well, home, not really. They go to now a civil war. That's another story. That was number one. 2, the state seizes the property of the entire land. Remember the Masonic Ritual 33. The land does not belong to anybody. It is to be distributed, perhaps? No, it is not distributed. The state keeps it. The power keeps it. That's number 2. 3, the first government of the People's Commissars is created, and from here the measures are much more specific. These are the first days of the revolution. 1, suppression of any newspaper that opposes the government. All newspapers except 2, Pravda and Izvestia, which are 2 communist newspapers. Shortly after, next week, the week after, military distinctions are abolished. For the moment, it is purely an ideological measure. They'll bring them back almost immediately because they understand that an army without military distinctions is not going to work very well. It's going to be pretty useless. The banks are nationalized. The other sources of wealth, land and banking, the banks belong to the state. What were the gentlemen of that Kungloeb thinking here, the American bankers? If they were dreaming of doing business on the other side of the so-called later the Iron Curtain, of course, also all the schools, the religious schools of the Orthodox Church are seized. Religious education is ended. This is the second week. The right to strike is prohibited. That is in the homeland of the workers. The right to strike is prohibited. Why? Lenin describes it as a crime against the people. He is the people. It's like Louis XIV in France. L'État c'est moi. The state is moi. Okay, well, all that goes against the party goes against him because he is the people. So instead of the state is the people, is moi, yeah? And if you strike, you are criminals against the people. And it is better to say that you are a criminal against the people than that you are a criminal against the state. Yeah? The factories are nationalized. The other source of wealth, a few more days, industry would be the state industry. A code is written for the use of revolutionary tribunals. A code, a law, and norms, because there were none. They were judging whoever fell into their hands in the whole of Russia without any type of code or norms or rules. Whatever those popular tribunals decided, that is what went. As in the French Revolution. Poor you if you fell into the hands of a popular court at the time. That was the same in Madrid at the beginning of the Civil War in 1936. So that was the model. Now, housebreaking by the police is legalized because, as incredible as it may seem, the police are given the power to break in the residence of any Russian person without any judicial order, and from the first it is usually the night hours that are chosen. These are called the Chekas, the political police. In a few months there will be as many as 250,000 agents of these political police, the Chekas. A brutal, really repressive machinery. Also, scientific torture is invented. Scientific torture. There are electric grills. Doctors sometimes are present, not necessarily to help the patients being interrogated, but actually to prolong the torture as much as possible. The Chekas are the creation of Trotsky. In the first stage is about 1,000, around 1,000 people a month. Few compared to what is to come yet. Purges are two types. Mass purges to finish off what they call the people of the past. To purge the people of the past, whom they thought as impossible to re-educate. For example, the clergy or the nobility, even some bourgeois conservatives. Liberals too. Thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands. When the Soviet Union fell from the year 1989, there have been many Russian historians who have investigated this sort of thing. For instance, if you were condemned to 10 years in prison, that meant necessarily the death penalty. They investigated, they couldn't find him, and they realized that the 10 years was just a code for death penalty. Elimination of large sections, numbers of the population. There are also foreigners' purges. After World War II, the Allies actually gave Stalin sort of half of Europe. They agreed amongst themselves, yes, you take all the way up to here and we take this side. Sort of playing dumb a little bit, because one of the reasons, okay, so you can take this part of Poland, but you must accept that you have to hold elections or something like that to Stalin. Well, you can you can imagine Stalin saying, I can't believe this, guys. Okay, so what you're giving me Poland, and what I have to do is to hold an election. Sure, I'll hold an election. Actually, I'll hold 3, 10. How many do you want? I can certainly hold elections in Poland. That was the reason. Half of Europe is sacrificed. Internal purges of some calculate about 100 million people in 70 years. They will also have purges against their own within the party. The worst years were the years 36 to 38. 5 of the 7 presidents of the Central Executive Committee of the Communist Party were eliminated. 5 of 7. Of the 11 central ministers of the Soviets, they killed 9 out of 11. Local secretariats of the Communist Party, 43 presidents, more than half of those secretaries. It was brutal. None of the highest positions really survived holding those positions. A complaint was enough. Everyone was suspicious. It was a reign of terror, basically. Okay, in the other half of Europe, actually, the idea, and it took academics and revolutionaries in Western Europe a long time to accept what was happening there. But communism and Marxism became very popular amongst students at university. I remember the 60s and the 70s, yeah. Of course, the revolution like that didn't take place in the West, but there was a very strong cultural presence in the West too. And I do remember it. If you are of my age, in France, in Italy, and everywhere. Now, there is a school called the Frankfurt School, which is a Marxist school of academics or neo-Marxists from the 1920s. They're intellectuals. Most of them Jewish and Masons. Erich Fromm, Marcuse, Habermas, Adorno, very popular in the 60s. Marcuse, especially in Berkeley, California. A very prominent group of academics that actually come together and form a school of Marxist thought that tends to be, it will eventually end up in social engineering that we call today. From Germany, they were dispersed and they came to the United States, Columbia, University, Berkeley. Marcuse actually almost preaches there, is the idol of the students in the 1960s. And that is when you start the cultural revolution of the 60s. It is a sexual revolution primarily. It's actually destroying the traditions of, your parents and of the past, cutting clean, as it were. But is, free sex and so on. But it was not natural, that movement. One, if you study it carefully, you could say that it was almost forced, encouraged, fostered by these sacred monsters of the Frankfurt School. My goodness, when I was a student who used to hold them up, the Frankfurt School, when you look at the results of all their teaching, is what we have today. Their theories consisted on teaching young students to see man in society as a colonized man, exploited by the institutions, exploited by the family, and he must be liberated from both. Here you find the origin of gender ideology, how to combat all these. Well, here you have also another Freemason, Freud. He recognizes that many of his writings originated in the, we know this, okay, that he was a member of the one of the Viennese lodges to which he belonged. His birthday, as a matter of fact, was celebrated in a very notable way before his death in that lodge. And he made a very heartfelt tribute to his lodge, which was actually the Jewish Freemasonry lodge, where his documents were and his doctrines were first ironed out, as it were. And of course, he's the one who promotes the theory of pansexualism. We are moved only and mainly by sex. which the Frankfurt schools adopt as their own and take all that even further. So what we all have here is what they preach is to fight against repression. Everything was repression. We are all repressed. What kind of repression was that? The one that a civilized man imposes on himself in order not to behave like an animal. But, good manners, okay, but you have to come out of that. You had to be free and happy. They maintain that the basic impulse of man is purely sexual, and that is the only one that can liberate him and fulfill him as a human being. But add that the son, the outcome of sexual reproduction, listen to this, the outcome of sexual reproduction is not natural. That's quite a way to go. It is actually reproduction, or the baby, the next generation, is actually an enemy of man, because what is natural is just the sexual impulse. Man does not want to reproduce. What he wants is sex. So for the first time you find also, and this goes together, you're beginning to see also a negative vision of motherhood. You have to disassociate now motherhood from sexuality, or sexuality from motherhood. You have to exalt sex as the vehicle by itself of liberation, sex for sex sake, as it were. That was the sexual revolution of the 60s, that practically finished the family off, and comes from this school, the Frankfurt school, free love. Students were taught that the great masters, okay, that from these great masters, that you had to decolonize yourself from the family, from the institutions, not to mention religion, of course. And from the 60s, what remains in the West is the feeling that the only liberator that you have is that sexual impulse. The family is a scourge. Motherhood is more than a scourge. It's unnatural. How can you get to the position, for the first time in the history of mankind, that motherhood is unnatural? I think I mentioned in another video Caroline Hanna, a Swedish lady from one of the agencies of the United Nations, who said very explicitly, she speaks of motherhood as reproductive work and as a biological injustice to women. It's something that women have to endure, and is something that women have to be freed from, because otherwise they won't be able to fulfill themselves, herself, as a person or professionally. Motherhood is slavery. It is really the first time in the history of mankind that motherhood is presented as a woman's scourge. By abortion, of course, is to liberate her from that enemy that is impending her hindering her development. It is the most diabolical thought that has been thought of in in Western thought. And has been actually now consecrated as a sort of the summit of philosophy, so admired by these great thinkers. These ultimately are monsters at the service of chaos, which is what is the ultimate end. In the service of the dismantling and dissolution of Christian Europe, of a Christian society, at the service of the dissolution of civilization, of Western civilization. And they have left now a desolate Europe from which it is very difficult to, it's going to be very difficult to rebuild. It is scorched earth. And it is now the policies that are promoted through the United Nations and taken all over the world, throughout the world, these philosophies. But you know, I think they have overreached. I have met very many young people. I'm actually hopeful because I think there is a turning round now. I do think so. I don't think I'm deceiving myself. Because when you talk to young people, actually, and you explain a few things, they recognize the truth, and they recognize, if they haven't been already, if they're not in this cult mentality, if you just explain it to them, the ability to recognize truth has not been eroded. That is still there with many young people, and so I find myself hopeful that they have reached that far, and they can, you know, they're not even hiding anymore. Is out there. And I have a feeling that when evil is out there so openly visible to be seen by everyone, is when they have lost. It's not when they are hiding. They can still manipulate it. This is the last, this is the last possibility that they have at the moment. That is why it's all out in the open now. Okay, I'm going to close here, but what I'm saying is that throughout all this, that chaos and revolutions and the destruction of Christianity in Western Europe, I hold that it was never spontaneous coming from the people, but it was always planned and organized. That's my thesis. Okay, so thank you very much. And I don't know what I'm going to talk about next. I want to give this a break, and I'll think of something else. If you could share and subscribe and do whatever you can. Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye.